Marcus, welcome. I am so glad you could make it today. Please sit down and make yourself comfortable.
Dr. Rachel, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me. I have to say, of all the conversations I've ever looked forward to, this one is right at the top of the list.
That is very kind of you to say. I always enjoy talking to people who are genuinely curious. It makes the whole conversation so much more interesting for both of us.
I have been fascinated by forensic psychology for years, but I realized recently that most of what I know comes from television dramas and true crime podcasts. So I wanted to ask someone who actually does this work in real life. What is it really like?
That is such a refreshing place to start. And you're absolutely right to question the gap between what television shows and what actually happens. The real work is far more nuanced, far more human, and honestly, far more interesting than most dramas ever manage to capture.
In what way? What does television get wrong?
Television tends to focus on the dramatic moments, the courtroom revelation, the psychological breakthrough in a single session, the moment the criminal confesses everything. In reality, forensic psychology is a slow, careful, and deeply methodical process. It's about building a complete picture of a person over time, not a single lightning bolt moment.
That's already so different from what I imagined. When you say building a complete picture, what does that actually involve?
It involves many things working together: detailed interviews with the individual, psychological testing, reviewing their personal history, their childhood, their relationships, their patterns of behavior over time, speaking with people who know them well, reading court documents and police reports carefully. Every single piece of information adds another layer to the picture.
That sounds incredibly complex. How long does that process typically take?
It depends entirely on the case and the purpose of the assessment. Some assessments take a few days, others can take several weeks or even months. When I'm preparing a report for a court, for example, I need to be absolutely certain that every conclusion I draw is supported by solid evidence. A person's entire future can genuinely depend on what I write in that report.
That's an enormous responsibility. Does that weight ever become difficult to carry?
Honestly, yes. There are cases that stay with you long after they're closed. Cases where the human story is so complex and so painful that it's impossible to remain completely detached. I believe the best forensic psychologists are the ones who feel that weight and learn to carry it without being crushed by it. The moment you stop feeling anything is the moment your work starts to suffer.
I find that really moving, actually. Can I ask about the criminal mind specifically? Is there such a thing as a criminal personality, a type of person who is simply wired to break the law?
That's one of the most fascinating and most debated questions in my entire field. The short answer is no, there's no single criminal personality, but there are certain psychological traits and patterns that appear more frequently in people who commit serious crimes. Things like impulsivity, a lack of empathy, a distorted relationship with reality, or a history of childhood trauma and neglect. So it's never simply that someone is born bad. Almost never. The research is very clear on this point. Human behavior is shaped by an incredibly complex mix of biology, psychology, environment, and lived experience. What we sometimes call a criminal mindset is almost always the result of many different factors colliding over a long period of time: a difficult childhood, a lack of stable relationships, untreated mental health conditions, social isolation, the effects of poverty on early development. It's rarely ever one single thing acting alone.
That genuinely challenges the way I've always thought about it. I think I had this idea that some people were just fundamentally different from the rest of us.
Most people start with that assumption. It's actually a psychological defense mechanism. If we believe that people who do terrible things are completely different from us, it makes us feel safer. It creates a comfortable distance between us and them. But the uncomfortable truth is that the line between who we are and who we might become under very different circumstances is thinner than most of us would like to believe.
That's genuinely unsettling in the most fascinating way. Can you give me an example of how environment shapes behavior in cases you've seen?
Without identifying anyone specifically, I can share a pattern I've observed many times across many different cases. A child grows up in a home where violence is completely normal, where love is unpredictable and conditional, where the adults around them model aggression as the only response to stress or frustration. That child's brain literally develops differently as a result of those experiences. The neural pathways associated with empathy and emotional regulation develop less fully than they should. By the time that child is a teenager, their entire relationship with the world has been shaped by an environment they had absolutely no control over whatsoever.
So the brain actually physically changes based on those early experiences?
Absolutely, it does. This is one of the most important findings in modern neuroscience and psychology combined. Early childhood experiences have a profound and lasting effect on brain development and structure. This doesn't mean that people can't change. They absolutely can with the right support and intervention. But it does mean that by the time someone ends up in the criminal justice system, there's almost always a very long and deeply painful story behind that single moment.
This is making me think completely differently about crime and punishment. Can I ask about psychopaths? Because that word gets used everywhere, and I honestly am not sure I actually understand what it really means.
You're not alone in that confusion at all. The word psychopath is used very loosely in popular culture, and it's consistently misunderstood. In clinical terms, what we're usually referring to is a condition called antisocial personality disorder, or more specifically, a distinct cluster of traits that include a significant lack of empathy, superficial charm, highly manipulative behavior, an inability to feel genuine remorse, and a persistent pattern of disregarding the rights and feelings of other people.
When you list those traits like that, it actually sounds like a description of some very successful people in business or even in politics.
You're not wrong, and that observation is actually supported by credible research. Some studies suggest that certain psychopathic traits appear at notably higher rates in high-achieving professional environments than in the general population. The traits themselves are not automatically destructive or dangerous. It's the combination of those traits with certain life experiences and personal choices that can ultimately lead to genuinely harmful behavior.
That's genuinely mind-bending. So, a psychopath is not necessarily a violent criminal.
Correct. The vast majority of people with psychopathic traits never commit violent crimes at all. They may be very difficult to have close relationships with. They may cause harm in far more subtle and quiet ways. But the image of the psychopath as a violent predator lurking in the shadows is largely a media creation. The reality is far more complex and far more quietly present in ordinary everyday life than most people ever realize or want to acknowledge.
I think my entire understanding of this has completely shifted in the last 15 minutes. Can I ask about your work in the courtroom? What do you actually do when you appear as an expert witness?
As an expert witness, my role is to present psychological evidence to the court in a way that's clear, completely objective, and genuinely useful to the process of achieving justice. I might be asked to assess whether a defendant was of sound mind at the time of the offense, or to carefully evaluate the risk they pose to the public going forward, or to explain to the jury why a victim responded to trauma in a way that might seem completely illogical or even suspicious to someone without a psychological framework. My job in those moments is to explain the science behind why trauma affects human behavior in ways that are entirely understandable once you have the right framework to view them through.
That makes an enormous difference to the outcome of a case.
It genuinely can, And that's honestly one of the most meaningful and important parts of my entire work. When psychological evidence helps a jury understand something they would otherwise misinterpret entirely, and when that understanding leads to a fairer and more just outcome for someone who's already been through something truly terrible, that feeling is very difficult to put adequately into words.
I can only imagine how powerful that must feel. Before we finish, I have to ask the question almost everyone asks you. Have you ever been in a room with someone and felt genuinely frightened by them?
That is a question I receive more than almost any other. And the honest answer is yes, but perhaps not in the way you might be expecting to hear. The moments that have stayed with me most powerfully are not the ones where someone was openly threatening or physically aggressive. Those situations are deeply intense, but they are at least clear and readable. The moments that are truly and lastingly unsettling are the ones where someone is completely calm, completely pleasant, entirely cooperative, and apparently normal in every visible way, and yet something underneath all of that surface presentation is simply not there. A kind of quiet absence where something genuinely human should be. That still, cold absence is far more disturbing than any outward display of aggression or violence ever could be.
That is one of the most chilling things I have ever heard anyone describe so calmly and so precisely.
Welcome to forensic psychology.
I think I genuinely need a moment to process everything we've talked about today. This has been one of the most fascinating conversations of my entire life. You've completely changed the way I think about human behavior, about crime, about the mind, and honestly about people in general.
That makes me very happy to hear. These are questions that are absolutely worth asking and worth sitting quietly with afterward. The more genuinely curious we become about why people behave the way they do, the more compassionate and the more clear-eyed we grow as human beings. And both of those things make the world a measurably better place.
That is a truly beautiful way to end this. Thank you so much, Dr. Rachel. I mean every word of that.
Thank you, Marcus. You asked wonderful and genuinely thoughtful questions today. The very best conversations always begin with real curiosity, and yours was absolutely and completely that. Please take good care of yourself.
You too. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart. This was truly unforgettable.
The pleasure was entirely mine. Goodbye for now, Marcus.
Goodbye, Dr. Rachel. Thank you.